Well, they're not. I told our coach, back up, coach. Yeah. Yeah. We'll narrow that down. Yes, yes. Well, That's what sounds sweaty. 2 days in a row. I was happy, I appreciate it. Just a few days ago. Yeah.
Right.
Well, they have that is happening too. Great. Right. We're playing Saturday. Yeah. 3 months. It's like a free for all. Just throwing it out.
Something happened, I was like, okay, well, whatever. Yeah. Well, they can see what happened. That they will find something now, they were themselves. After they started the school, tried to run some business. Then it sort of crossed over. We were recruiting these kids to come to join us. Westchester community team that's at college. Make sure you know. Before you were after you're here, when we get all the guys and you do like or something.
Let me find it and I'll send it over to you. They have them.
Yes. Jeremy Hall.
I mean, I'm sure.
Good evening and welcome to the November 1st, 2023 planning meeting of the Southwestern School District School Board. I apologize for the delay. Our executive session ran a little longer than what we had anticipated, as there was a student discipline matter and a contract to be discussed. That being said, if we could all stand and pledge to the allegiance to the flag, please. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty.
Mr. Mummer, roll call, please.
Mrs. Berger. Mrs. Boyer.
Here.
Mr. Clausby. Mr. Galzella.
Here.
Mr. Mummert.
Here.
Mr. Plessick.
Here.
Mrs. Weaver.
Here.
Mrs. Jinxt.
Here.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Here.
8 present, 1 absent.
I did get information from Mr. Klausby earlier today that he is under the weather. That's the reason he is not here this evening. I do have a group of people who have signed in for observing of tonight's meeting. If anybody wishes to, they can address the board at a later time. Additions, deletions, and modifications to tonight's agenda?
There are none.
None. Hearing of persons who wish to address the board on any agenda-related items. Okay, moving on. Matters for which board action is required, Personnel Committee, Mrs. Berger, please.
Thank you. I'd like to make a motion to approve items 8A, 1 and 2.
Second.
We have a motion by Vanessa Berger and a second from Rich Plessick for agenda items 8A, 1 and 2. Comments, questions?
So these are just leaves and employment.
Okay. Roll call, please, Jeff.
Mrs. Berger.
Yes.
Mrs. Boyer.
Yes.
Mr. Galzella.
Yes.
Mr. Plessick.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
Mrs. Jinxt.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes.
Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Next item is Finance and Support Services, Mrs. Jinxt.
Thank you, Mr. Mummer. I'd like to make a recommendation that we approve agenda items 8B1.
Second.
We have a motion by Amanda Jinxt, second by Rich Plessick for agenda item 8B1. Comments, questions with regards to this item?
This was the contract with Aptigee that Dr. Burkhart had discussed with us in executive session.
Okay, any other comments or questions?
I'd just like to applaud the finding of the app. It looks like it's going to streamline our communication with our entire community, make us more efficient in getting our information out, and our old ones going obsolete from what I hear. So I applaud you being able to find a good replacement. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Roll call, please, Jeff.
Mrs. Boyer.
Yes.
Mr. Galzella.
Yes.
Mr. Plessick.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
Mrs. Jinxt.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes.
Mrs. Berger. Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Next on the agenda is our Program Committee, Mrs. Weaver.
Good evening. I'd like to make a recommendation to approve items 8C, 1 and 2.
Second.
We have a motion by Amanda Weaver and a second by Rich Plessick for agenda item 8C, Program Committee, items 1 and 2.
Item 1 is a recommendation to approve the settlement agreement for a student with disabilities, and item 2 is a recommendation to approve the request for 2 students to be granted early graduation effective immediately, having satisfactorily completed all state and local requirements prior to the end of the first semester of this school year.
Okay. Any comments or questions with regards to those 2 items? We're good. Roll call, please, Jeff.
Mr. Galzella.
Yes.
Mr. Plessick.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
Mrs. Jinxt.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes.
Mrs. Berger. Mrs. Boyer.
Yes.
Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Next item is other matters for board consideration.
Individually, if we could. Oh, am I? I'm just asking we do them individually, each policy.
I was just going to
Okay.
ask if you were to do those motions.
Okay. All right. So first up is 8D1, which is a recommendation to approve the tentative adoption policy 113.3 screening and evaluations for students with disabilities.
Second.
We have a motion by Matt Gelazell and a second from Rich Plessick for agenda item 8D1. Comments? Questions? Roll call, please, Jeff, on that item.
Mr. Plessick.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
Mrs. Jinxt.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes.
Mrs. Berger. Mrs. Boyer,
Yes.
Mr. Gonzalez,
Yes.
Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Second would be 8D2, which is a recommendation to approve the tentative adoption of policy 204, attendance.
Second.
We have a motion by Matt Galazelle and a second from Rich Blessick for agenda item 8D, number 2. Comments or questions on that item?
I had a quick question on that. So in the attendance for the policy, it recognizes absence for attending religious ceremonies as allowed for specific, I forget the specific word, but yes, yes, for denoted religions. I'd just like to know what religions we officially recognize for their holidays, basically. That's in that policy. I just wondered what we do and don't recognize.
It's a good question. Typically, it's a rare request, but if it does, it's for, I don't know of anyone that would fall outside of the main, the more
The more common.
common, I hate to say common, but the more
Yeah.
common religions in this area, in our district. But I'm not aware of any one that would, typically, the ones that we know of are the ones that would be Christian, Judaism, things along those lines.
Yeah, I'm looking for this.
I'm looking at the code and it doesn't specify one way or the other, a particular religion that should be honored and those that may not be honored.
Here it is. Observance of religious holiday
Mhm.
observed by a bona
Bona
fide
fide.
religious group. I just wondered what bona fide religious groups were, out of curiosity. It's not really an objection. It's just I'd like to know what's considered bona fide.
That's a
We're
great
gonna
question,
refer to
and
it.
I don't have a bona fide answer for you.
You're gonna let people off for Wiccan
I don't,
Day, right?
yeah,
mean-
I don't know. Mr. Galazza, honestly, that's a great question. I don't know. I've not been aware, I've never been made aware of one that would be considered like, hey, Jay, take a look at this. What do you think this is? So it's a good question. I just haven't had experience with whether or not something would fall within where a principal would contact me and ask, do you think
Okay.
we should do with
So
this?
that's my only concern with that one is if we're gonna refer to a bona fide religion, we should identify what's considered bona fide.
I mean, we could, but that language is very directly from the code.
From
From the code 11.21, religious holidays and religious instruction. Students may be excused from school for religious holidays observed by bona fide religious groups. I mean, every once in a while, our firm has received questions about the holiday and we might reach out to the parent or, to say, where do you worship?
Case by case.
Yeah, but
Okay.
generally speaking, it's sort of the more traditional holidays, but on a case-by-case basis, we get the question and we try to verify it in some way based
That
on the
that was my
information.
question. It's like,
Yeah.
if someone challenges with bona fide, how do we respond to
Yeah.
that, right? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know how you guys respond, but we end up getting a lot of questions about it if there's a question, and
Okay.
we will reach out and try to
okay, fair enough.
work with that
We'll
religious
refer-
institution.
We'll refer to you.
There you go.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions on that item? Roll call, please, Jeff.
Mrs. Weaver,
Yes.
Mrs. Yingst,
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman,
Yes.
Mrs. Berger, Mrs. Boyer,
Yes.
Mr. Gonzalez,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
8D3 would be recommendation to approve the tentative adoption of policy 221, dressing and grooming.
Second.
We have a motion by Matt Galazelle and a second from Rich Blessick for agenda item 8D3. Comments or questions?
So I have one in relation to this too. So I see we're inserting a language, board directs district staff to support students experiencing educational instability by waiving penalties related to delay in compliance with board policy or school rules related to dress and grooming. So I'd just like to clarify what we're considering educational instability. If it's, my understanding of just looking on the internet, it was related to homelessness.
Yes, so educational instability are for students who fall into one of four categories. One might be a student experiencing homelessness. They might be a student in foster care. They could be a student in the juvenile justice system, or they could be a child whose parents are maybe in a custody dispute, in which case they have left one particular school district and have entered into another school district in a year. So most of that act, which was now generally referenced as Act 1, most of that act pertains to the protections for a student who might be in a high school
in one district and they come to another high school and there's all these different high school graduation requirements, right? And then
Okay.
we don't want them to start all over again. But there are some other, we'll just say, ancillary foci of that particular act, which is basically saying if a student is going from one district that may not have a uniform requirement, whether it's for gym or in the general day-to-day, that they are not penalized immediately for not having the immediate resources based on whatever instability they're experiencing.
Very thorough. So we have categories that are specifically identified
Yes.
in the legality under what's
You-
educational instability.
You could go to policy 251 and get
Okay.
a whole plethora of information on Act
And-
1.
That's my first question. Very
Yes.
well answered. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And then the second part would be where we refer on page 2 to staff members shall call questionable arrests to attention of the building principal. I would suggest we add dean of students there. And also, is that a referral to the building principal prior to addressing it? Or are we still having our teachers address it? And how are they supposed to know who's in the educational instability category as they encounter these students doing the various?
I mean, I think typically if it's referred to the principal, it's a dresser grooming that would be causing a disruption. For example, it might fall outside of, it might have vulgarity on it. And while that student may be experiencing educational instability, they would still be required to either A, put on another shirt or turn it inside out. If it's a gym uniform, more often than not, the counselors are going to be aware that the student is coming to us from another school year. So they might have a conversation prior to the student even arriving, that there's some flexibility there so that they don't call the student out or make them feel, obviously different than the rest. So I would think that when you're calling it to the principal, it's typically a disciplinary issue that might be considered a disruption, again, such as a shirt that might have a vulgar phrase on it. But not typically, it would not usually be associated with the educational instability. That educational instability wouldn't give carte blanche to violate the dress code in a way that's disruptive.
So lower level is just teacher handled?
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of times our teachers have excellent relationships with the kids. They'll say, I use mine, I'm like, Jay, turn that shirt inside out. It's not appropriate. They, might have an advertisement for alcohol or something and say, just turn that inside out. Okay. And so 90% of the time, Dr. Downs, would you agree that it's, or more, the students are great, the teacher just says, come on.
Okay.
And they just, they have
And
great
you
relationships.
touched on the other question I had. So we give 4 bullet points for reasons to address this. None of them specifically address vulgarity. So where would you place that? So we have present a hazard to health or safety of students, materially interfere with work, school, create disorder or
Right there.
disrupt educate that one?
Right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because they'll be saying, look what his shirt says, or look what her
Okay,
shirt
fair
says. So,
enough.
yeah.
Okay.
That goes back to Tinker, right, Dr. Dawn?
It sure does.
Yeah.
Armbands, 1969.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Roll call, please, Jeff.
Mrs. Jingst,
Yes.
Mr. Zimmerman,
Yes.
Mrs. Berger,
Yes.
Mrs. Boyer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver,
Yes.
Mr. Mummert.
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
And the last one under 8D would be number 4, recommendation to approve tentative adoption of policy 233, suspension and expulsion.
Second. We have a motion by Matt Galazal and a second from Rich Plessick for agenda item 8D4. Comments or questions?
So for this one, I just had one specificity of language I wanted to understand. So page 2 of it, it says at the very beginning, principal designee superintendent may suspend student for disobedience or misconduct for a period of 1 to 10 consecutive days, school days. And then you go on to page 3 and it says, district shall offer to hold an informal hearing within 5 days of suspension. A student may be suspended up to 10 days following a hearing by the building principal. So 10 days following a hearing, which is 5 days, that's 15. But we have in the beginning of the policy up to 10 days, which seems like it's wording that works against itself.
I don't. So the 1 to 10 is the suspension. And so is it this language,
Right? So-
your second?
Right, so right here, a student may be suspended for up to 10 days following a hearing by the building principal. Right above it, in 5, we
Right.
have,
So normally the hearing, because in that first suggestion about a suspension of 1 to 10 days,
right,
there is, if you are out of school for, if we know, if the building principal knows they're gonna be out of school for more than 3 or 4 days, then there has to be what they call the informal hearing. So even here, I mean, we have the board hearing for expulsions, which is beyond 10 days. So
Right.
there, even when you go up to 10 consecutive school days, or even when then it still requires a hearing, but it's the informal hearing. But I don't, it's the way that the 12.7 is worded.
Yeah, and I looked back at the
regulation.
referencing
Yeah.
law, and it was just as.
Just as confusing.
Just as working against itself, and I just
Yeah.
suggest we clean it up. If we're gonna say we can suspend for 1 to 10 days, then we shouldn't, in the next paragraph, say we can suspend 10 days following hearing, which is 5 days additional. We're doing either 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. We can't put both in our policy.
Well, the first one is consecutive. It says 1 to 10 consecutive days, and then we could change it, but it still doesn't change that even if there's a suspension, before you reach 10 days of suspension, you still need to have a hearing. It's just a different type. It's an informal hearing, and you can suspend a student for 3 days without a hearing. And after the 3 days, you need,
Right, and it follows up later saying a student may not be excluded from school for longer than 15 days
and
without a formal hearing.
yeah, and that's actually,
So
yes. Mhm.
that again references the 15, which is why I think we should just clean up the front part to read 1 to 15.
Yeah, I mean, the 15 is not something, that's those extra 5 days are only if the student is considered a health, or it has to be mutually agreed upon between the parties,
Right.
and it has to be if a student, and or if the student is considered to be like a threat to the health and safety of students. So there are exceptions. I mean, I can look at it and try to make it more accurate, but the law itself has a lot of like exceptions. Yeah.
Yeah. and That, yeah, obviously, we want that language to be clear so our parents understand it, but our administrative team knows that nothing beyond 10 days without board action, because the 11th day on is considered an expulsion. So I understand your point, what you're saying, because we know that because we live it.
Right.
Our parents may not know that because they don't. And
Right.
so, Dr. Dalton and I can try to work,
That's
and
my
maybe,
suggestion on
yeah.
that,
but I rest assured to our community and our parents, we would not violate the students' rights and go beyond that 10 days without taking them to the board. So, but again, making sure it's communicated appropriately so parents understand that is essential. So we can definitely work on that.
And then the last question in relation to that, and going back further to the expulsion part, our language says, no student shall be expelled without the opportunity of formal hearing before the board, duly authorized committee of board, which is 3 of us, or a qualified hearing examiner appointed by the board. So when do we use a qualified hearing?
That's me.
So when do we appoint you? Because under this language, you're just entitled to do it. It doesn't give a caveat when you can and can't do it. You're appointed
At the board,
permanently,
I mean, generally, so the general practice is or I should say, if it is the board's general practice to have the solicitor serve as the hearing examiner, that normally happens. There are times when you might need, that is in this situation where it might be where a family has their own attorney, and then Dr. Burkhart might say to me, Lee, can you serve as, can you represent the administration? So it's a more traditional sort of hearing with counsel for the administration and counsel for the family. And then we would appoint an outside hearing examiner outside of, our firm that would be sort of independent to make the decision. That's what it is anticipating. But oftentimes administrators, well, there isn't an attorney from the parents' family side. And so the administrator doesn't request any attorney support. And so that is normally, and then it's a hearing. I serve as the hearing examiner, but more to sort of help operate how the hearing takes place.
but it's an expulsion. So if we're using a qualified hearing examiner appointed by the board to do the expulsion, is the board still involved?
It can be, again, that's a practice of the board. You could have a hearing examiner serve without board decision. And then like the hearing examiner would oversee the process and then go back to the whole board and advise the whole board on the situation rather than what currently happens, which is a small committee of the
Right,
board.
and that's my
Yeah.
concern in looking at that is I want the board to continue to be involved in all expulsions.
Right, yeah.
Like blanket, have some level of involvement with expulsions. I think that's, so I just want to make sure that language maybe adds like a qualified hearing examiner as appointed by the board for this specific
Okay,
case.
sure,
So
yep.
we're saying, okay, you can take this case as opposed to giving you the blanket authority to do expulsion.
Sure.
Other comments or questions? Okay, we can vote on this tentative adoption